Welcome to this webinar from the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Today we are discussing the relationship between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. The background, which most of you probably know, is in one respect very simple. The PRC considers Taiwan to be part of its sovereign territory. Taiwan has, however, in practice been a separate country since 1949, when the then Kuomintang government of the Republic of China retreated to the island following defeat by the Chinese Communist Party. But Taiwan is formally recognized as independent by only 14 countries: Belize, Haiti, the Vatican City, Honduras, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, Paraguay, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Tuvalu, and Guatemala. Other governments maintain a largely silent public position as part of an understanding that led to the admission of the PRC to the United Nations in 1971. This arrangement has generally worked, give or take periodic tensions, but the posture of the Chinese government under Xi Jinping has been notably more assertive, and although the background is very different, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia a year ago has led to much speculation about the potential for China to attempt to seize Taiwan by force. But that discussion has largely been dominated by voices from, or at least perspectives of, the PRC and the USA. Today, we're giving voices from Taiwan itself a greater platform than they have had in the last 12 months. Martin Purbrick will chair the discussion, and I will leave any more detailed introductions to him. But could I just remind those who are joining us that the speakers will be taking questions, so if you wish to put anything to members of the panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Martin will endeavour to see that you get an answer. I would thank you for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Martin and our three panelists.
Michael, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the chance for RSAA to host this webinar as well on a very important subject. I won't say anything more about the issues around the PRC and the ROC, which you very eloquently introduced there, but I think suffice to say that it's a complicated situation, a more complicated situation than many people understand, I think, or anticipate. And it's been increasingly complicated in the past several years, partly because of the growing rhetoric from the PRC government, or the more assertive rhetoric from the PRC government, that Taiwan is in fact a province of the PRC, which is a very different narrative from that of both the major political parties from Taiwan. Also, I think I would highlight the US government position, which seems to have been changing in the past several years as well, with a slightly more strident line of approach towards Taiwan and support for Taiwan in certain senses. And Taiwan, of course, is a lively democracy itself that some US politicians perhaps have taken advantage of to make political statements. And obviously we can see the visit by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi some time ago and what that resulted in. So I think this situation and the tension around it that Michael mentioned, especially in relation to the war in Ukraine, has created the global debate about Taiwan in the past year especially, and several years increasingly. And most of the voices we hear in this global debate are from the PRC and the USA. So I think there's less attention paid to voices from Taiwan. And hence, I think this panel today and the discussion is particularly important because we have three very accomplished academics from Taiwan to give a Taiwanese perspective on the view of the Straits from Taipei, their perspectives on US-PRC-Taiwan relations, trade involving Taiwan, supply chains, including the semiconductor industry, which has become much more of a serious issue for Western countries in the past 2 years from the COVID pandemic, and the outlook for security and peace in the region. And I think we are talking about the region because obviously any conflict around Taiwan would immediately have an impact on the wider region. So this panel, I think, is particularly important to stress the need to hear voices from Taiwan. And personally, I've always found that there's a greater understanding of the Chinese Communist Party and many issues in China from Taiwan than there is elsewhere in the world. So our panelists are of great value. If I can just give a very quick introduction to their background. Professor Yu-Shan is academician and distinguished research fellow at Academia Sinica. His major interests are in political and economic transitions in former socialist countries, constitutional engineering in nascent democracies, and theories of international relations and cross-Taiwan Strait relations. His publication record is extraordinary, 25 books and more than 160 journal articles in English and Chinese. Also, we have Professor Arthur Ding, who is Professor Emeritus at the National Cheng-Hih University in Taipei. He is now an adjunct professor at both the NCCU and Taiwan's National Defense University. And his research interests and focus have been on China security, including China's security policy and China's defense, party-military relations, as well as China's defense industry. And last but very much not least, Dr. Lei Chun-yi is director of the Taiwan Studies Program at the University of Nottingham here in the UK, prior to which she's had academic roles at the University of Duisburg in Germany and Leiden University in the Netherlands. Dr. Lee writes extensively about China and Taiwan and related issues affecting the global economy. So the format today, we're going to have some introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and that'll take about 10 minutes each, or depending on how long they wish to speak. And then we'll have time for discussion based on questions from the audience. So please do put some questions into the Zoom chat, and I'll collate them and get to them after our panelists have given some introductory remarks. So perhaps we could kick off with Professor Wu. Professor, it would be very nice if you could describe to us the divergent political systems of the PRC and the Republic of China. And that might seem quite apparent, but I think it's worth updating ourselves on this. How have they diverged, perhaps more in the past decades? The differences between the Leninist system of the PRC, the liberal democracy of the ROC, and how this impacts on cross-strait relations, and how you see those cross-strait relations because of the differences in systems. So over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think the most important thing about cross relations is obviously that we are talking about the possibility of a war. And the institutional differences between Taiwan and mainland China obviously is a very important factor. And in the sense that for a lot of people in Taiwan, the fact that we are a liberal democracy and they are a Leninist party state makes our institutions and way of lives completely incompatible, so that we do not want to be part of this communist party state. And this tendency towards breaking any ties, institutional ties, legal ties, or whatever, with mainland China, then became a very annoying thing for the communist leadership in Beijing, because they are thinking that they are losing Taiwan permanently. Not a long time ago, between 2006 and 2016, when Ma Ying-jeou was the president, and he was from the KMT side, the party that advocates possible ultimate reunification with mainland China. When he was around, the biggest problem for us in Taiwan seems to be the inundation of the island with mainland tourists. But nowadays, we are talking about actually whether we are going to fight a war. So I think, yes, indeed, we are at a critical moment, and things have been changing rapidly, and the institutional differences between us and them is one of the factors contributing to the current tension. Let me make a comparison between Taiwan and Ukraine, because I think that can shed light on why we have this increasing tension, because Ukraine, we are already have 1 year of Russian invasion and intensive fighting. So let me make a comparison, and first by sharing this. So as you can see, this is the globe. and this is the PRC, and this is Russia, two great continental powers. And then Taiwan is here, and then we have Ukraine. What the PRC is to Taiwan is very much like what Russia is to Ukraine. And we can clearly see that Taiwan and Ukraine compete to be the most dangerous place on earth. And I remember very vividly that not long ago, I think it was in May 2021, when The Economist has a cover depicting the island of Taiwan and calling it the most dangerous place on earth. And then, Lord behold, in February 2022, that's almost exactly 1 year ago, Russia launched an invasion into Ukraine. And ever since then, the comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan are very much in people's mind. It was never like that. I have been studying East European and Russian politics for many years. I've never seen any comparison between East Asia and Eastern Europe so obvious in people's minds. So a comparison, and I think it's a legitimate one. And the question of will Taiwan become the next Ukraine is very much in people's mind. Now, I think the reason for Russia to invade Ukraine has, there are three major reasons. The first one is Ukrainian politics. It has been tilting towards the West. The country wants to be part of the West, and there has been perceived de-Russification in Russia, and that antagonized not just Putin. And we tend to think that this is Putin's war. I do not agree. I think there is a consensus among Russian elite that Ukraine is such an integral sphere of influence, so to speak, of Russia, that if it goes to the West, becomes part of the West, that would be totally unacceptable, especially in view of the many Russian-speaking people in Eastern Ukraine and ethnic Russians. And the second reason is the strategic rivalry between Russia and the West. From Russia's point of view, the West has been pushing relentlessly towards the border of Russia by admitting new members of NATO and EU and so on and so forth. So the strategic rivalry between two great blocs is in the background. And the third one, obviously, is we have a military balance that was perceived to be very much in favor of Russia. So not only the Russian generals, but also Western intelligence officials, they are all talking about Russia would be able to take Kiev and Ukraine probably in weeks, if not in days. So we have all these three elements that are very much in the background to push for Russia's decision to invade Ukraine a year ago. And I'm arguing that we are seeing exactly the same things in Taiwan. We are seeing in Taiwan politics very clear tilt towards breaking legal ties with mainland China and perceived de-Sinification on the island. And what Martin says about the huge differences, institutional differences between Taiwan and mainland China, we are a liberal democracy, they are a communist Leninist state, contributes greatly to that. Also contributing to this fact is how we think about our history. We have changed our history textbooks. We have political divide between different national identities now, and now more and more people are accepting the fact that we are quite different from the Chinese on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. So in Taiwan politics, we are seeing this tilts towards away from mainland China. And China is very much worried about losing Taiwan permanently. This is very much like the Russian anxiety over Ukraine's tilt towards the West. And we have this US PRC hegemonic rivalry, which was not exactly the case because Russia was much weaker than the PRC. And so the US did not perceive Russia as a real challenger, but the US does perceive the PRC as a genuine challenger. So we have this thing going on in the background. And Taiwan then is not just something that may antagonize the PRC. Taiwan has become a battleground for the rivalry and the confrontation between the two big superpowers in the world. And the third one, obviously, is the changing military balance in favor of the PRC. So we have all the three factors agitating for the outbreak of the Ukraine war a year ago. And we have basically the same factors in the Taiwan Strait. So we are worried about the outbreak of a war. And finally, let me say that you can see that in Taiwan, this is factor number one. In Taiwan, we have various elements in domestic politics that are tearing the country apart. We have those factors that are tilting towards rapprochement with mainland China, and when the conditions are ripe, ultimate unification. And the first one is divided nation. If you take a look at the Republic of China's 1947 constitution, which is still in effect today, this is a one China constitution. So legally speaking, there's no quarrel with the other side as to we should become one nation someday in the future. And the other thing is economic integration. Taiwan has been so economically integrated into mainland China. Our outbound investment concentrates on mainland China, or trade concentrates on mainland China. We show them so much that we enjoy a unprecedented trade, favorable trade balance with them. But on the other hand, the power symmetry between Taiwan and mainland China scares people in Taiwan. We think that if we talk about unification, we'll be just swallowed by them. And so this power symmetry is working against getting closer to the mainland and very much for Taiwan independence. And finally, this rising Taiwan identity, which has a lot to do with the institutional differences between the two, is also pushing in that direction. So we have the blue camp trying to get Taiwan closer to the mainland, improve relations, regional rapprochement. These are the things that KMT is trying to do, the major opposition party. And then we have the opposite direction of tilting towards Taiwan independence, even legally Taiwan independence. And this is the ruling DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, is trying to do. So we are torn apart. And this is Taiwan politics. And among the three factors that I think would have the greatest impact on cross relations is domestic politics of Taiwan. I think when we are talking about Ukraine, we generally overlooks the development of domestic Ukrainian politics in the run-up to the Russian invasion. And I think we should take a very close look at Taiwan politics, especially in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election. So Taiwan politics will play a major role in determining whether Taiwan will follow in Ukraine's footsteps. Thank you very much.
Professor Wu, thank you. That's fascinating introductory overview, I think. I think it's not unusual to see liberal democratic societies being torn apart at the moment on issues such as this, which obviously states such as Russia and the PRC to some extent might be encouraging. So perhaps can we switch across to Professor Ding now? And Professor Ding, so your president, Tsai Ing-wen, may have intended to preserve the cross-strait status quo when she took office in 2016. But the PRC government seems to have its own agenda, so perhaps it's driven the changes in relationships with Taiwan in the past few years of her office. So in that context of how the relationship has changed, do you think a balanced relationship between the Taiwan government under President Tsai and the DPP can be reached with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party leadership, or is this imbalance a permanent state of relationship now?
Okay, thank you for the invitation by RSAA, Royal Society for Asian Affairs. I guess my presentation will somewhat complement Professor Yu-Shan's remark. So let me put on the. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So the topic assigned to me is about the the Taiwan Straits under President Tsai. So here's a fundamental difference. Actually, Wu-Shan already mentioned, Professor Wu already mentioned. There's a fundamental difference between the ruling party DPP and the Chinese Communist Party over the nature of the so-called Taiwan Republic of China and the broader China. I put it in the broader China. For DPP, Taiwan is ROC. So the following is cited from the 1999 party resolution. I'm sorry to say I didn't find the official translation, so it's my own. I hope it can be very precise. The party resolution says Taiwan de facto is an independent, sovereign, democratic country with its territory covering Taiwan, Pescador, Matsu, and associated islands, as well as territorial sea and contingent zones. According to current constitution, its government name is PRC, which is not affiliated with the ROC, which is not affiliated with, nothing to do with PRC. So, so you can see, for interpretation of what is the ROC, there's a difference, not just between the ruling DPP and the opposition Kuomintang, and also, different between the DPP and the Chinese Communist Party. For CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and the PRC, if you read their textbook, they always say Republic of China does not exist anymore, and Taiwan as an island is part of the China and is a province, which is represented by PRC internationally. So this is CCP and the PRC's position, but here is a kind of a very weird situation, because frequently the CCP require or request the DPP back to the ROC, the constitution. So the question is that if you don't recognize, if you don't see ROC exists, then how can you request and how can you require the DPP go back to the ROC constitution and follow the ROC constitution? So here is the kind of a dilemma for the CCP here. And for Kuomintang, no doubt, so-called 92 consensus means that the one country with different interpretation. For Kuomintang's position, ROC represent the whole China, while they also acknowledge the PRC claim to represent the whole China. So here's the fundamental difference between the three, the ruling DPP, opposition KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party. President Tsai, I guess he knows that this kind of very complicated, delicate situation. So she somewhat moved toward the middle, I would say, in her 2016 inaugural speech. With the DPP's 1999 party resolution as the background, he indirectly introducing the so-called one China element in her inauguration speech. He said that according to ROC constitution and the act governing relationship between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area, seems that he will enforce and implement the so-called the China policy. But she did not endorse so-called One China directly. No. Let me repeat. He endorsed One China indirectly, not directly. So after her inauguration speech, Beijing's response, Beijing said this is an answer which is not complete, implying that Beijing acknowledged she made some compromise further in the direction Beijing has desired, but still not enough. So here's I guess Xi Jinping factor really matter a lot in this context. Xi Jinping inherited the #2 world power status in the world after PRC had so-called 3 decades of reform after 1978. Xi Jinping is a kind of extremely ambitious leader with overconfidence, probably in the wake of the biased assessment of external environment. We all know that in the past 2 years, he's in an internal meeting, he said rise of East and the decline of West. And there's no doubt after 2008, so-called global financial meltdown, China survived the financial meltdown, and there's no doubt United States and the Western European countries all suffer from the economic crisis. So overall, not just the Xi Jinping, probably I would say all the people on mainland China, they have a kind of confidence, say that China is growing and become the #2 power, and China requests more. So probably this contribute to a speech made in January 2019 by Xi Jinping. He publicly advocating so-called political consultation for the ultimate unification. And this create actually a very strong backfire in Taiwan. Since then, he exerted tremendous pressure and sanction against Taiwan and totally cut off the communication between the two sides. And there's no doubt he wants Taiwan to accommodate to PRC's pressure. But I would say, compared the DPP, two different periods of administration. Under Chen Shui-bian administration in China, the leader was Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. At that time, China still, doing the so-called economic reform, and is not so powerful as the #2 world power yet. And so at that time, there's some actually they have between two sides, we had indirectly communication. So still kind of a communication going on at that time. But when Xi Jinping was the leader, he totally cut off the communication between the two sides. It's kind of for me, it's kind of a tactical to exert pressure, the DPP government. Anyway, so we can see the difference between the Xi Jinping and his predecessor dealing with Taiwan. But I would say it's in a different context here. Look at the futures. We all assume that Xi Jinping will continue his term in the future. So there's several factors here. The first one is about the U.S.-China relation after the 2024 presidential and the congressional election in the United States. And in next year, we have our presidential and the parliamentary election. Which party will become the ruling party, we don't know. And also how Xi Jinping make assessment of the PRC's recovery and the growth after the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that Xi Jinping somewhat moderate his, we call the wolf warrior foreign policy these days. So if we, several messages from friends conveyed by friend in Beijing, Shanghai said, because we have internal problems. So this might contribute to, partially you can explain Xi Jinping somewhat moderate his foreign policy and try to restore the communication with United States and probably European countries. Also, the linkage between political legitimacy and the unification of Taiwan. In CCP's 20th Party Congress in year 2027, when Xi Jinping seeks the fourth term. And also, the 2027 is the year of PLA, People's Liberation Army centennial anniversaries. So how this play out, we don't know. But before 2024 election in Taiwan, I would say Xi Jinping will display a moderate face toward Taiwan, because we see actually his Taiwan policy backfired since 2019, when he tried to push hard for the push forward for the so-called political consultation for the ultimate unification. So so seems the only uncertain factor element is that the new House Speaker McCarthy's visit to Taiwan. When will, we don't know. Will he or when, we don't know at this moment. And there's another rumor says that President Tsai will visit the United States. So I would say, in general, the atmosphere before the year 2024 election should be no accident, and should be somewhat stability, although the PLA jet fighter will continue to fly in, encouraging to our ADIZs. But aside that, except that, then I would say Beijing will not escalate the tension, because escalate tension will not conducive for will give munition to the DPP to win the election in 2024. So probably let me stop here, and we will see the Q&A. Thank you.
Professor Ding, thank you very much. 2027 seems a long way away. 2024 doesn't seem so far away, but I think, as Harold Wilson, a former Prime Minister in Britain, said, a week is a long time in politics. So I think anything can happen in the near future in Taiwan, based on, as you just said, whether the House Speaker of the US visits Taiwan soon, and what would be the PRC reaction to that. So much can change. Dr. Lei Chun-yi, we'll go straight over to you. And obviously, a lot of your research has focused a little more on the impact on business and the economy from the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan ROC. So could you tell us a little bit about your views on what you've termed, I think, navigating stormy waters in the past few years, and the rhetoric from the PRC government, and how that might signal far worse stormy waters in the coming several years? How does that affect Taiwanese companies, other companies, both Chinese and Western companies doing business in Taiwan and with Taiwan, and the sort of cross-strait business view of that situation?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for both professors and RSAA for this wonderful, meaningful webinar. Previously, I thought I would not use the slides, but Professor Yu-Shan Wu's very good starting points prompt me to share my slides. Actually, I was also talking about the most dangerous place on earth, which is Taiwan. But my point here is also along with what Martin assigned to me to talk about, is about the not just about the desirable, not just about the dangerous place, but actually it's also rather desirable place on earth. Because what I would say, although Taiwan is pretty much under the threat of the PRC and also the fighter jets, but again, well, those are both professors prior to my talk then indicated to us about the dangerous relationship between Taiwan and China. But what I wanted to emphasize more so is the strength of Taiwan and irreplaceable of Taiwan, not only to the Chinese, but also to the global markets, which is a semiconductor. And this is what I see, that the productions of the semiconductors from Taiwan actually has a share of the global market more than 65%. And in that sense, Taiwan is crucially important to the global semiconductor market. And before I delve into these semiconductor wars, I just wanted to also say a little bit what is semiconductor to be used for. So if you consider your car, for example, all these parts of your car actually has to be powered by this chip called semiconductor. You could argue that chip size to be small or big. For instance, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, has already been producing the 2 nanometers very small chips for the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing. For the car, maybe not so big, maybe 7 nanometer or 18 nanometer, but all the electronic products in any modern time, given what we are using now, including your mobile, your microwave, your car, all rely on the semiconductor. And this is what I link back to Professor Wu's first talk about comparing Russian invasion on Ukraine, which was really sad and still continuing war, and what we can think about what if China invaded Taiwan. So Russia invaded Ukraine, caused the inflation in Europe and also energy crisis in Europe. But that is, if we think what happened if we can't really access to all the electronic products in our modern life, which I just illustrate to you, use the car as an example, that Taiwan has been the main manufacturing site for the semiconductor of the global markets, 65%. And this is what one cannot really imagine if Taiwan is invaded by the mainland Chinese army. So this is what I illustrated to us about this kind of the supply chain. So as I said, that the front-end wafer fabrication that is manufactured by Taiwan, based in the TSMC in Hsinchu Science Park, the whole ecosystem, not just the company of the TSMC, but the whole semiconductor manufacturing system is supporting the global semiconductor manufacturing, supporting our modern life. And that is what I would say unimaginable if what happened of President Xi decided to invade Taiwan by force. And this is what I mentioned. This is the company that you could see about the semiconductor TSMC. It's based in Hsinchu Science Park, and it has been since 1960 started to produce the semiconductor manufacturing. Of course, it has a very close connection with Silicon Valley. One argue that is because of the developmental states. This is that Taiwan has been located by the state's indication. Taiwan's government allocate a lot of resources to the semiconductor manufacturing, but it's also actually relying on a very high-skilled workforce in Taiwan. Generations of the Taiwanese young engineers has been devoted their time and their energy, 12 hours a day as a shift to work in the semiconductor-related company, not just TSMC, as I mentioned, it's an ecosystem. And again, I mentioned the Hsinchu Science Park and the satellite companies that they are supporting TSMC. So to come back to what Martin asked me about the economic and business relationship between China and Taiwan, yes, I would say that it is a very important key factor to consider the coal independence. But in fact, the production, as I mentioned, of these key components, semiconductor, the chip manufacturing in Taiwan is going beyond, has already gone beyond China, Taiwan. Its impact and link to the global manufacturing, global semiconductor manufacturing markets. One cannot live without the chip manufactured by the Taiwanese TSMC-led ecosystem. So there's the argument to say that whether the semiconductor manufacturing can shield Taiwan from the Chinese invasion. I think there are a lot of debates about that, and I think just to consider, we could actually also to consider if Taiwan start to produce the semiconductor, what would happen? The supply chain would disrupt it. All of our electronic goods may not be able to avail to be easily to access to as we can do now, and the price would definitely go higher. And we do not know whether the supply chain being disrupted, how soon or will I be able to reconnect it again. So all that valid points to support and also to encourage people to think that Taiwan is important, it's dangerous, but it's desirable, and for a very important reason that semiconductor manufacturing is not that easily to be transferable to other countries, although of course you can address this point that TSMC now is being invited to invest in Arizona, and they were started to build the fab. The fabric already started, but the bigger scale, commercial scale of manufacturing is not easily to be achieved in any short time. Not only for America, Chinese also rely on Taiwan. So I see this kind of dangerous but desirable and irreplaceable link between China and Taiwan and go beyond Taiwan, link to the world. And I think I will leave here for the audience to probably discuss with us a little bit further.
Chun-yi, that was very nicely put, if I can say so. And I think it's a very interesting comparison you've left us with there. Obviously, the risk concentration in Europe has been the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on energy supplies, and that risk concentration based on especially natural gas supplies to Western Europe, and the risk concentration between the PRC and the Republic of China seems to be this 65% of semiconductors supplied from Taiwan, and what would the impact on the global economy be on that if it was disrupted? It's a very, very complicated question, because obviously disruption of that semiconductor supply chain would adversely affect the PRC immediately as well. So complex factors to consider, but perhaps we could cut across to some questions now. We still have plenty of time. And firstly, I'd like to go to Tina Zhong from Voice of America, because she sent a question in advance as well. And Tina has two questions, so perhaps I could read them first and then put them to Professor Ding and Professor Wu separately. That would be helpful to give each a chance. And we have some other questions from the audience we'll go to for Chun-yi and the others also. So from Tina, Voice of America, firstly, in light of the current tensions across the Taiwan Straits, how do you see the significance of the visit to China by Kuomintang senior official Anthony Xia and his meetings with Chinese officials, specifically Mr. Wang Huning, who you know is a long-standing member of the Politburo, serving under 3 presidents of the PRC, and what impact does this have on the unification strategy, and does this help to ease tensions? Secondly, the second part of the question, according to the Kuomintang statement, Mr. Xia reaffirmed the party's position on the 1992 consensus. Do most people in Taiwan still support this political framework between Taiwan and the mainland? So may I suggest for the first question, perhaps we could go to Professor Wu. So Professor Wu, would you like to take that part about the visit by Andrew Xia, the meetings with PRC officials, and specifically Wang Huning?
Yes, I think the Kuomintang is not only trying to cool down the tension across the Taiwan Strait, it is campaigning. It is aiming at the Taiwan voters, trying to tell them that the Kuomintang is capable of talking to the mainland Chinese, whereas the DPP cannot. And so, whoever is the presidential candidate of the KMT, the Taiwan voters should vote for him or her, because this is going to bring about peace instead of war. So I think this is going to be the main strategy of the KMT in the upcoming presidential election. I think they are campaigning. Objectively speaking, I would say that if there's anyone who can talk directly with the other side to conduct a dialogue, that would be better than if there's no communication at all between Taiwan and mainland China. But obviously, to try to talk with the communist leaders without safeguarding yourself with sufficient self-defense would be naive. So let's see if the KMT can prove that it has the ability of both communicating with the other side and the ability to strengthen Taiwan's defense at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Ding, may I ask you for the second part of that question from Tina? So just to remind you, yeah. Tina asked, according to the KMT statement, they reaffirmed the party's position on the 1992 consensus. How do you feel about the level of support for that from Taiwan people?
Well, I guess, you know, again, what is the 92 consensus? Different people have different interpretation, frankly speaking. As far as the opinion poll I read, probably over 50%, if not 80%, the voter probably perceive the 92 consensus kind of each country in each side of the Taiwan Straits, so-called 一边一国. So it's involved how should we interpret the 92 consensus. People have different perception, but probably I would say the opinion poll I read shows that over 50% interpreted the 92 consensus as, you know, the one country in each side. But aside from the interpretation, I would say probably the majority of people they probably seek a kind of a peace and a stability. So that's why the both side, the both party, you know, the Kuomintang and the ruling DPP, now as Professor Wu said, now enter the campaign period now. So the DPP also realized that they have to change its so-called the argument these days. So because previously DPP created a perception that, you know, to resist the so-called the CCP to protect Taiwan, so-called 抗中保台, but now it seems somewhat changed to so-called peaceful means to protect Taiwan. So this implies that the DPP realized that they have to change their discourse so that they can attract the majority vote to show that the DPP can also maintain the peace and the stability in the Taiwan Strait. So the 90, I don't see the 92 consensus for the majority people. They really think the 92 consensus is such important, because as I said, the over 50% of the voters perceive the 92 consensus kind of a country, one country in each side of the Taiwan Strait. So actually, if majority over 50% of this have this kind of perception, actually it's different from the CCP's expectation, frankly speaking. So, but On the other side, as I say, the people want peace and stability. So that's why the both parties have the committee cannot rely on the 92 consensus alone. So they also have to these days the current committee chairman Eric Chu advocating so-called double D dialogue and defense, as already as mentioned by Professor Yu-Shan, the double D. So that's why the committee also to show that on the one hand we want to have dialogue with Beijing, but on the other hand we have to strengthen our defense capability. So I would say, there's kind of a convergence between the DPP and Kuomintang.
That convergence will make the election in 2024 very interesting then, how they differentiate themselves. But a very interesting point. Thank you very much, Professor Deng. So we have several questions about defense and deterrence and military action around Taiwan. I think it's dangerous to get into perhaps this binary question of will Taiwan be invaded or not? I'm not sure if it's a yes or a no question, so we probably won't put this binary question, but perhaps firstly for Chun-yi, perhaps can you say something more about deterrence, especially in relation to what you just said about the global reliance on the semiconductor industry from Taiwan. So what impact does deterrence have on preventing the PRC from considering military action against Taiwan? And do you think that deterrence is continuing to be effective?
It's a very difficult question, Martin.
Sorry.
I used to, but I do. I am a political economist in training and still learning the logic of it. So in my belief, originally, I believe as from the training of my theoretical background, that economic interdependence suppose should work as a deterrence instead of the nuclear power. It didn't really happen from the Russia invaded Ukraine. And it is exactly come back to Professor Wu's presentation and worry, which I share completely. But I still would say, because of this, I wouldn't say the production of the semiconductor is totally irreplaceable. I wouldn't say that. It's possible to replace, it's possible to reproduce in elsewhere, as you could see. China, America is doing that, and also Japan has already invited TSMC. And no doubt that China has been working hard to have a breakthrough of the semiconductor production. And yet, it is still not quite possible for any other country that to produce the chip without a TSMC's manufacturing. You could argue that South Korea has a percentage, but they have 16%, and their U rate, which is the perfection rate of the production, is comparatively very low. In my argument, I think this is a deterrence. But again, it probably couldn't really work out if one is arguing from putting similar logic of kind of got to record the Ukraine to the motherland and for the historical reason, and no matter at all cost, and then these deterrence wouldn't sustain. But I still hope that would do, because at this stage, the point that I'm talking now, China rely on Taiwan. And this is the very reason that they couldn't just shoot a missile and destroy TSMC or occupy Taiwan, hoping that would just business as usual, because it just can't work like that. And probably my deterrence is not as powerful as a nuclear power, but this is what I can say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's well put. And let's go on to deterrence and defense if we can, or stay with that. And Professor Wu, perhaps we've still got time. I'd like to bring in some comments from you on that area, deterrence, defense, because you mentioned defense at the start of the webinar and the comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine. So how do you see this issue of defense of Taiwan and how it's changed in the past year, especially after the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Is there a substantial backing within Taiwan for a change in the defense posture, and how realistic is that? And how much can you rely upon friendly nations such as the US, perhaps Japan? So how do you see the outlook for deterrence and defense for Taiwan, and how that's constructed by the Taiwanese government?
Okay, so very big question. I would see defense as a kind of deterrence, because if you can defend yourself very effectively, then that would reduce the incentive of your enemy to attack you, because they know that they can't defeat you. And so that would deter them from launching the attack. The other kind of deterrence is deterrence by punishment. And that's the typical deterrence we are talking about. For example, nuclear deterrence. That is, I'm going to impose on you a kind of unacceptable punishment so that you would not dare to attack me. I don't think that Taiwan is in possession of any means of deterrence of punishment, because we cannot. I mean, there are people talking about shooting missiles at the Sanxia Grand Dam and Beijing, Shanghai, whatever, but I don't think that's realistic. So Taiwan can only concentrate on deterrence of defense. And in terms of defense, there are two thinking. The first one is obviously whether we can rely on our allies to defend us. And that's really, I mean, Taiwan cannot depend on that, because, for example, President Biden has said, I think 4 or 5 times, that the United States would get itself directly involved in defending Taiwan. But then right after each time, right after he made such remarks, his officials from State Department, whatever, would then come out and say something which is contrary to that. There's no change of America's China policy and so on and so forth. So we cannot depend on that. And that boils down to, if we cannot do defense by punishment, and we have to do deterrence by defense, and we cannot rely on United States and Japan for that, then we have to rely on ourselves. But then our military is overwhelmed by the other side. So nowadays people are talking about asymmetry. That is the deterrence of asymmetry. If we can show to the other side that if you attack us, we will be able to use those weapons of asymmetric defense to make your invasion unsuccessful, then we can deter you. So this is the argument going on nowadays. Now people are talking about the Stinger, they are talking about Javelin, they are talking about the Ukrainian use of like urban warfare and so on and so forth. And many people in Taiwan are saying that we should not depend on tanks or warships or fighter jets, because they will be destroyed in the first few weeks, if not days, of the invasion of the PLA. So we have to hide our troops in the cities, to launch, to ambush them with stingers and asymmetric weapons. My problem with that is that Taiwan is an island, and our best defense is that we can deter, we can put a lot of cost on our enemies when they are trying to get across Taiwan Strait, namely by sea and by air. And I just don't see how you can do that, imposing great costs on your enemy when they are trying to come through air or sea without the ability of an air force, without missiles, without ships, and let them to land on the soil of Taiwan and to engulf them in guerrilla warfare and try to defend our cities and consume them and so on and so forth. I just, I'm not convinced by that kind of argument. So basically, we cannot do deterrence by punishment. We have to do deterrence by defense. We cannot rely on our allies. We have to beef up our defense. And we are in the debate of whether we should strictly follow the asymmetrical warfare doctrine, or we should keep some of the conventional weapons in our hands as the best means of defense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. That was a very thoughtful answer, and there was a lot in there, actually, which I think we can unpack later as well. I just say to all of the audience members, by the way, I have been paraphrasing your questions. Please excuse me, I haven't read them all out directly, but I've been paraphrasing them to panelists to take your points. So excuse me for not mentioning all of the names. As we're coming up for time, I perhaps could I ask Professor Ding to have a chance to have a few closing remarks as well, because Professor Ding, you talked about the outlook in your slides earlier. The 2024 elections, 2027 Chinese Communist Party meetings. So obviously there's a rather long time frame. Well, as I said, a week can be a long time in politics. There's a long time frame through 2024 and 2027. But we could have, for example, a visit to Taiwan by the US House Speaker in the next few months. Anything can happen, or as you said, perhaps President Tsai might visit the US. There are a number of flashpoints that could cause increased tension. How do you see the outlook in the next 1 year, in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years? What are your views on whether tension can be diminished, or are you a little more pessimistic about the outlook?
Lots of speculation these days in Taiwan about the Speaker McCarthy's possible visit, or a visit by President Tsai to the United States. So all this led to the somewhat this what I call the uncertainty here, because most assume that the Beijing will heighten its reaction much worse than the one held in August last year. For instance, more large-scale military exercise, more fighter jets across the median line, so on and so forth. So all kinds of speculation. So what I can say is that all these kind of speculation lead to the somewhat uncertain and the potential tension toward the next year, toward the our so-called presidential and the parliamentary elections. So those are the what I say the uncertain elements. So frankly speaking, how Beijing will react, we don't know. But we all assume that the Beijing will have more intensified, more larger scale military exercise, mobilize more, deploy more fighter jets, warships, so on and so forth, to show its its muscle and against Taiwan, against the United States, so on and so forth. So so inevitably, there's a kind of uncertainty and a lot of potential tension there. So those are my response. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Ding. Thank you very much, Professor Wu and Dr. Lei Chun-yi. It's been a pleasure hearing your views, and I think we can all benefit from your insight. I'll hand back to Michael at RSAA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I would just like to add my own thanks to our three outstanding panelists for giving us their time today, and for an exceptionally stimulating set of presentations and discussions. And thank you also to Martin, who has chaired this event today. Our next event will be on the 8th of March, and we will be staying with China. Victoria Jones will be talking about China's agenda in the Himalayas, geopolitics and culture. It will be a hybrid event held at the Royal Astronomical Society in London and online. A notice about it will go out shortly, so please keep an eye open for that, and I hope that you will be able to join us then. For now, I would simply again thank our panelists and Martin and say goodbye for now. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Fine.
Thank you.